Every house on Miller Street has changed owners at least twice in the last 20 years. Except one. 214 Miller Street has been officially vacant since 2003. Neighbors will tell you, quietly, that vacant is not the same as empty, and at least 4 residents over the past 2 decades have moved away within a year of learning exactly why Miller Street is an ordinary residential block in a mid-sized town. Tree-lined, quiet, the kind of place people move to for stability. Nothing about it suggests anything unusual, except for one property that real estate agents privately refuse to list and that the town's own records office has, for reasons never publicly explained, marked as not for transfer for over 20 years. Claire Bennett moved into 212 Miller Street, the house directly beside it, in the spring of 2019, relocating for a new job and looking forward to something quiet after years in a crowded apartment complex. She'd heard vague rumors about her new neighbor's house from the realtor during the closing process, delivered with the kind of careful vagueness that made her more curious, not less. When she asked directly what the rumors were, the realtor simply said, "People talk. Old houses get stories attached to them. I wouldn't worry about it," and changed the subject. For the first 2 weeks, nothing about 214 Miller Street registered as unusual at all. The lawn was overgrown, but not dramatically so. The windows were dark, curtains drawn, exactly what you'd expect from a house that had simply been sitting empty for a long time. Claire settled into her new routine, introduced herself to a few neighbors, and largely forgot about the realtor's odd hesitation entirely. 2 weeks after moving in, Claire noticed a light in the second-floor window of 214, faint, warm, exactly the kind of glow you'd expect from a lamp left on in an occupied room. She assumed, reasonably, that someone had finally moved in, or that a property manager was doing maintenance work in the evenings. She mentioned it to another neighbor the next morning, expecting a simple explanation. She got a long pause instead, followed by, "That happens sometimes. Just don't go over and check." Over the following week, Claire asked 3 more neighbors about the light, hoping for a straightforward answer. A caretaker, a timer on an old lamp, anything logical. Each conversation followed roughly the same pattern. An initial attempt to dismiss the question, followed by a subtle change of subject the moment she pushed for specifics. One neighbor, a man in his 60s who'd lived on the street for over a decade, told her flatly, "You'll stop asking after a while." Everyone does. Claire, being the kind of person who doesn't take advice like that easily, walked closer one evening to get a better look at the property itself. As she approached the fence line, the curtain in that same second-floor window shifted, slowly, deliberately, the way a curtain moves when someone on the other side is adjusting it, not the way fabric moves in a breeze that night, didn't exist at all. She stood frozen for nearly a full minute before backing away toward her own porch. Curious now rather than simply unsettled, Claire spent an afternoon at the local library archive and found a short article from 2003, a single paragraph, easy to miss, reporting that the previous owner of 214 Miller Street, a man named Harold Weiss, had been reported missing by family members. The house had remained in legal limbo ever since, tied up in an estate dispute that, according to the article, no relative had ever actually pursued to resolution, effectively freezing the property in place for 2 decades. Not satisfied with a single newspaper paragraph, Claire visited the county records office directly, requesting whatever public documentation existed on the property. The clerk who helped her seemed noticeably uncomfortable pulling the file, mentioning that it was one of those ones people ask about sometimes, before providing a thin folder containing almost nothing useful. A missing persons report filed by Harold Weiss's sister in late 2003, and a probate filing that had simply never been completed, listing the estate's status as permanently pending further information. The missing persons report offered a strange detail Claire hadn't expected. Harold Weiss's sister, in her original statement, described her brother as having called her repeatedly in his final weeks, insisting that someone had been living in the house alongside him without his permission. Not a break-in, he'd clarified each time, but something that had simply always been there, moving items slightly, closing doors he was certain he'd left open. Police at the time noted no signs of forced entry and no evidence supporting his claims, and the case was quietly downgraded from investigation to a standard missing persons file within a month. An older neighbor, Dorothy, who had lived on the street since the 70s and had known Harold personally, finally told Claire the version of the story residents didn't usually repeat to newcomers. According to Dorothy, Harold had spent his final years increasingly convinced that whatever was sharing his house with him wasn't hostile. Exactly. Just present, patient, and completely unwilling to leave regardless of what he tried. He used to say it felt like living with a very quiet roommate who'd been there long before he bought the place, Dorothy said. He tried selling twice. Both deals fell through for reasons that had nothing to do with the house itself. Buyers just changed their minds right before closing every single time. Dorothy produced an old photograph from a shoebox, 214 Miller Street as it looked in the 1960s, decades before Harold ever owned it. She explained that the house had passed through at least 5 owners since it was built, and that every single one, according to street history passed down informally between longtime residents, had eventually left under circumstances nobody could fully explain: sudden relocations, unexplained absences, one earlier owner in the 1980s who simply stopped answering his door one winter and was never seen on the street again, though no formal missing persons report was ever filed for him. Against every reasonable instinct telling her to simply stop thinking about it, Claire began quietly documenting what she observed from her own window each night, noting the timing of the light's appearances, which window it came from, how long it lasted. Over 3 weeks, she recorded 11 separate occurrences, never on a predictable schedule, never in exactly the same window twice, though always somewhere on the second floor. On the 12th occurrence, Claire finally saw something more than just the light itself. A faint silhouette standing motionless just behind the glass, facing outward toward the street rather than into the room. She couldn't make out any features, only a general human shape, still enough that she initially convinced herself it was a trick of the reflected streetlight. It remained in that exact position for almost 4 minutes before the light behind it simply went out. Roughly a month into her observations, the pattern shifted in a way that unsettled Claire more than anything she'd documented so far. The light appeared, for the first time, in the ground floor window closest to her own property line, close enough that she could see the same faint silhouette standing just behind the glass, motionless, facing directly toward her house instead of out toward the street. Unsettled enough to seek outside opinion, Claire contacted a private investigator who specialized in property disputes, hoping he might have encountered something similar or could at least explain the estate's frozen legal status. After reviewing the basic details over the phone, he agreed to meet, then called back 2 days later to cancel, citing a scheduling conflict that Claire didn't entirely believe, especially given the noticeably shorter and more distant tone of his voice compared to their first conversation. Claire returned to Dorothy's house, pushing for more detail than their first conversation had covered. Dorothy grew visibly uncomfortable, eventually admitting that she'd left out one detail intentionally, that in the years since Harold's disappearance, every new resident who had moved in close enough to notice the light, and who had pushed hard enough to investigate it, had eventually moved away within roughly the same time frame, about 4 to 6 months from their first real acknowledgement of what they were seeing. "It's never hurt anyone, as far as I know," Dorothy said carefully. "It just seems to want to be noticed. And once it has been, it doesn't really let up until you leave." Despite everything Dorothy had told her, Claire made a decision she would later question repeatedly. She walked directly up to the fence line of 214 Miller Street on a clear autumn night, closer than she had ever stood before, determined to get one clear, undeniable look at whatever was standing behind that glass. For the first time since she'd started watching, the silhouette moved, not away, but closer, until it was standing directly against the inside of the glass, close enough that Claire could finally make out the vague suggestion of a face, though every detail about it seemed to resist being clearly seen, as though her eyes simply couldn't hold the image steady. It didn't reach for the window. It didn't try to open it. It simply stood there, watching her watch it, for what felt like several minutes before Claire finally forced herself to step back. Claire walked back to her own house at a controlled but rapid pace, locked her front door, and sat in her darkened living room for nearly an hour without turning on a single light, watching her own windows as carefully as she had once watched theirs. Nothing followed her across the property line that night, or any night after, though she has since admitted she still checks, out of habit, every time she draws her curtains. 5 months after that night, almost exactly matching the timeline Dorothy had described for every previous resident, Claire listed her own house for sale. She has never publicly stated that 214 Miller Street was the reason, citing instead a job opportunity in another city, though she privately admitted to Dorothy, in their final conversation before the move, that she simply couldn't shake the feeling of being watched every single evening she spent on that street. A new family moved into 212 Miller Street less than 2 months after Claire left. Dorothy, watching from her porch as the moving truck unloaded, has said only that she hopes, quietly and without much conviction, that this time might be different. The light still appears at 214, according to residents who've lived on the street since. Never in the same window twice, and always, without exception, eventually turning to face whichever house happens to be occupied by someone new. 214 Miller Street remains, officially, exactly what it has been for over 20 years, a vacant property, frozen in an estate dispute nobody has ever resolved, sitting quietly between 2 occupied homes on an otherwise unremarkable street. Whatever moved into it sometime before Harold Weiss ever bought the place has, by every account gathered since, no apparent interest in leaving, and no apparent urgency about anything at all, except, perhaps, patience. This was story inspired by real urban legends about vacant properties and unexplained residential phenomena. If this story kept you up, subscribe. New stories every few days. And if you've ever experienced something you can't explain in your own neighborhood, send it to me. Your story might be the next one I tell.